All right, so today we're going to talk about genetic equilibrium and other mechanisms of evolution. Um, and so, what's important here to understand is that there's other ways to evolve other than natural selection. So, natural selection is one of 5 ways to evolve, but there's some other ways. And so, before we do it, we have to go over some basic vocab terms. One is a gene pool. So that's the genes in all populations. So like amongst the human population, there's a gene pool. Within that gene pool, there's variation. So like variation is caused by having different alleles. Remember, allele is part of a gene. There's 2 alleles for every gene, one from mom and one from dad. And finally is the allele frequency. So that's the amount of an allele found in a gene pool. So here's a picture of a representation gene pool. So remember, like each gene has 2 alleles, and then you put it into kind of a gene pool, and you can calculate the percentages, right? So here, I could calculate the number of big B's, right? Like I could figure out a percentage of the big B's and what percentage are little B's, right? And so you can do this to determine what we call the percentages. Here is what's called the allele frequency. So you can figure out the allele frequency in a gene pool. And what I want you to make sure you understand is that a change in allele frequency is what we call evolution. Remember, evolution is a change in a species over time, right? And so the only way to change something genetically is to change the alleles, or to have a different distribution of alleles over time. So how do you create variation? Remember, variation is one of the essential components for natural selection. Well, there's 2 ways. One is gene shuffling, and the other is mutation. So gene shuffling just occurs during sexual reproduction. So you get half your genes from mom, half from dad. But notice each sibling doesn't get the same half from mom or the same half from dad. So that's why like your brothers and sisters look different from you. Why? Because all the genes are shuffled with each offspring. And then also, like, mutations are occurring in your body, the DNA is changing. And so if you spend more time in the sun, UV rays cause greater mutation rates. Variation is important for evolution. Why? Because it actually helps a species adapt to an environment, right? And so here we have the picture of the light and dark moths. And so this is a type of pepper, I think it's a pepper tree moth or a pepper moth, I don't remember exactly what. But there was 2 variations, a dark and a light moth. And actually what happened was the light moth did best because they lived amongst birch trees in England. And birch trees have white bark or white trunks. But after the Industrial Revolution, those white tree trunks actually became dark. Why? Because during the Industrial Revolution, you had a lot of factories. Those factories produced a lot of soot. That soot got stuck on the white tree trunk and made it darker. So in that case, after the Industrial Revolution, dark moths started doing a lot better because they could camouflage. The point here is that the fact that these moths had both dark and light attributes, or there was variation within their species, allowed it to survive even though the environment changed. So what are some other ways? There's actually 5 ways evolution occurs. So here's one is natural selection, 2 is mutation, 3 is sexual selection, 4 is gene flow, and 5 is genetic drift. So there are actually 5 ways. And one way I remember that is there are 5 fingers on your hand. So just look at your hand and think, okay, there are 5 ways evolution can occur. So here's natural selection. We've talked about it. Mutation is another way that this can occur. Mutation alters your DNA, which alters the allele frequency, right? And remember, the change in allele frequency is evolution. Another way is what we call gene flow, also known as migration. So just remember that if you think about the gene pool, if people leave a population and go to a different population, the gene pool is changing, right? So here we can see, like, if this light-colored beetle goes here, now this allele frequency is different, right? because now you have genes for this light-colored beetle, and so when the allele frequency changes, well, you have the evolution. Here's another example where you have two separate populations, but then they start mixing, gene flow, and so the allele frequency will change. That also is known as evolution. Also, you have sexual selection, which is known as non-random mating. So they can, basically the idea here is where, in natural selection, you determine the nature selects for the most fit. But when it comes to finding a mate or sexual selection, or selecting somebody who, or an organism selecting a mate, they might not do it based off of fitness. They might do it off of something else. So, for example, like peacocks, the males have an elaborate feather. They have an elaborate tail that basically is quite long and large and cumbersome, and so, and also really bright. And so, Darwin, with his natural selection, would think that the male wouldn't do very well surviving, yet it does. And he couldn't figure out why they have such a long tail, and the reason is because it actually is used to attract females. So sexual selection doesn't always follow natural selection, but it's a way that allele frequency can change. And then the last one is genetic drift. So genetic drift occurs when small populations results in individuals having a significant impact on allele frequencies. And there's actually two ways genetic drift can occur. But what I want to focus here is that genetic drift only occurs when small populations arise. And so there's two ways you can get these two small populations. One is called the founder's effect, where you can get individuals that create a populate or colonize a new habitat, and then the bottleneck effect, where few survivors are left to reproduce. Notice, though, that they both start with like a couple people or a couple organisms. So they always start with, what they have in common is they start with small populations. So I'll give you an example of each. So for example, here we have, you imagine Columbus bringing different organisms to the U.S., right? Or to South America. And so what happens is, when he takes a sample of the organisms, in Spain, the organism frequency, the allele frequency might have been this. But let's just say he only takes these four, and then he brings them over, and they start reproducing. Well, these four might not be an accurate representation of the frequency or the distribution of alleles in Spain. It might actually just be a little different. It could be a lot different, a little different, but nonetheless, the frequency, the allele frequency changed. So therefore, we would say that evolution has occurred. Another way is if there's like some kind of catastrophe or something that kills a lot of the species. So, for example, in Hurricane Katrina, there was quite a bit of flooding, and so these flowers that normally maybe had a frequency of 66%, well, let's just say only these many survived. Well, because this sample size is so small, the frequency is going to change, right? It's not an accurate representation of what was there before, but it's just what survived. And so the frequency changed here. So whether it's a bottleneck effect through like a natural disaster or disease that drastically lowers the population, or whether it's moving to a different location and suddenly they're what they both have in common is starting with a really small population. And so if you think about it, the genetic drift, because it goes through a small population, lowers genetic diversity. Why? Because you're only starting with a couple people or a couple organisms or individuals, and that those people, because there's not a lot of them, don't have a lot of genetic diversity. So what are the 5 ways, if we review, to evolve? Well, one is through natural selection. That's what we talked about, right? A second one is through mutation that causes a change in allele frequency. A third is through genetic flow, which is moving from one place to another. We can say migration. A fourth would be like sexual selection, like non-random mating. And the last way is through, the last way would be through genetic drift. So genetic drift, remember, always starts with a small population. And remember, there's two types of genetic drift, what we call the founder's effect, as well as the bottleneck effect. All right. Well, what happens if a species or population stops evolving? So evolving is always changing, right? Well, we would actually say it's in equilibrium. So equilibrium, if the population's in equilibrium, that means it stopped evolving, it stopped changing. And this is actually a hypothetical, because if a species stops evolving, it'll go extinct because it's not able to keep up with its predators, that kind of stuff. But we can talk about it because there's calculations we can make from this. And so if the allele frequencies do not change, that means they must not be evolving. What do we call that? We call that genetic equilibrium. Well, how does genetic equilibrium occur? Well, it kind of makes sense, because if we know the 5 ways evolution occurs, here are the 5, right? If we don't want evolution to occur or equilibrium to occur, well, we just go do the opposite. So if evolution requires non-random mating, you should have random mating. If evolution requires genetic drift that starts with a small population, well, you need a large population. If you need migration for evolution, then no migration. Mutations, no mutations. Natural selection, no natural selection.